We have, and who do we have? Ambassador VALENSISE from Italy, from the Institute of International Affairs in Rome. Ambassador VALENSISE was ambassador to Germany and Brazil, inter alia. And then last but not least, we have General Sir James EVERARD, who used to be the DSACEUR at NATO during Trump 1, and also has a brilliant military career behind him. So, without further ado, we only have 50 minutes, so we'll start immediately with questions. The same question to everyone, and then we'll go to go to individual questions for some of for our speakers. So perhaps this to General Everhard first, as the military, as the NATO insider. Prime Minister Tusk correctly talks about internal threats to the transatlantic community, and even, however, do you share his assessment, General Everhard, that NATO is disintegrating? This is a term that even former SecGen Anders Fogh Rasmussen has used in recent days. Or is he exaggerating, or is he wrong? And if you agree, what needs to change so that NATO remains the rock and the bastion that has secured peace in Europe for so long? Or if you disagree, what is Tusk and Rasmussen and all the others who use these phrases, these words, these terms, what have they gotten wrong? What are they neglecting? General Everhard.
Thank you. Well, I think it's very dangerous to live in the moment. I mean, the NATO alliance is an alliance. It's not a coalition. You know, it's designed to endure over time. Capitals retain decision-making authority, you know, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. And if you look at the history of the alliance, you will see that it's been through a number of crises. Suez in '56, I mean, a whole list. The Portuguese '61 Goa crisis, French withdrawal from the NATO military structure, the Greek-Turkish tensions in '74, you know, the Euro missile crisis, the Iraq war, you know, endless crisis, and there's always been this tension, I think, between US leadership and European autonomy. But actually, I think the historical evidence is very clear. You know, European nations have been absolutely right to invest in NATO as responsible for their collective defence, and I think the Europeans recognise that having a seat at the European security table and all that brings them, gives them huge advantages. So I don't think the alliance is disintegrating. I think it's still pretty solid, but yes, both sides have got to understand the new language that unites or divides us. And you know, your last question, what do allies need to do? Well, all allies need to deliver on the commitments that they have made. It's as simple as that. Thank you.
Same question, Ambassador VALENSISE.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it is absolutely right to recall the frictions from an historical point of view that the alliance lived. But we have also to be, I think, realistic. Not over-dramatized, but let's be realistic. And I think that there is no precedent of a contrast, of a conflict, of a real conflict between the major partner and the Atlantic Alliance and the rest of the alliance. We can ask ourselves if there is a community of values, or if we are shifting from a community of values to community of interests from the point of view of the Atlantic Alliance. And unfortunately, and I say it with all my deep friendship for the United States, old deep friendship for the United States, unfortunately, when it comes to values, one can fear that the values between the two sides of the Atlantic tend to diverge dramatically. Take multilateralism, take cooperation, take rule of law as a global issue. Take the use of force. Take the justification of the use of force. it is absolutely true that we had several precedents in the last decades of use of force. But perhaps, and I say it with all carefulness, perhaps the difference today is that we have a kind of proclamation of the right of the use of force. Of the justification, not only a justification, but an indication that that is the right way to solve the international issues and the international controversies, which is, of course, very different from our culture, from our feeling, from our DNA on the European side, it would say. When it comes to interests, and I stop there, if the interests on both sides of the Atlantic are the ones that we saw in Munich last year, at the beginning of in February last year, when Vice President Vance came and made some robust declarations, say, in Germany, in Munich, giving an assist to a political party within the German political spectrum that raises many more reserves and many more objections than consensus. I'm talking about the AfD. When we think about the treatment that was reserved to President Zelensky in the Oval Office, when I think about the Anchorage meeting, and when I think above all about the national security strategy, the official national security strategy in the US, there I think we have some stuff on which to ask ourselves in terms of convergence of the interests. Of course, the right political attitude of the Europeans must be the one of trying to not to weaken further the links between the two sides of the Atlantic. On the contrary, to strengthen them as much as possible. But as we say also in Italian, it takes two to tango, and we need to have a more careful and more attentive and perhaps a more realistic partner in Washington that recognizes this alliance is not only in the interest of the European partners, but basically and still in the interest of the right projection of the US policy and US way of being in the world as a stable and reliable power.
There's a lot to unpack there. So we have General Eberhard, who's more on the sort of the position of this is yet another one of those periods of time in the alliance, and you take sounds like you're more on the Prime Minister Tusk side. Jim.
Yeah. First of all, I'm sorry. I'm not a U.S. Senator. I feel really bad for you. But if this is any consolation, I actually have substitute spoken for many, many important people, if that makes you feel better. So the general's right, the ambassador's wrong. But I don't think I don't disagree with some of the criticisms made, but I think what we're seeing is not a difference in values and interests in the transatlantic community for the most part, maybe with the exception of Spain. But we are seeing a dramatic shift from the U.S. in the approach of tactics. And there's been a dramatic shift in the last 18 months, which is not just a departure from what we've seen many other presidents do, but it's even actually a departure for President Trump from his first term, and even from the opening of his second term, when he fixated on the NATO summit and the 5% commitment. And the difference is Trump is trying to strengthen the transatlantic community from the bottom up rather than the top down. And so we're seeing a dramatic shift into the focus on the bilateral alliances. And it's not to split the alliance. This is not the 16+1 where we want to pick everybody apart and deal with them all individually. It is to use the bilateral relationships to then build, I think, stronger consensus at the top. And there's two aspects to this. One, I think, is more important than the other. Yes, There's a political dimension to this, where the United States would like to strengthen relationships with people who are like-minded. And if you look across the conservative space in the US, in Canada, Latin America, in Western Europe, there are increasingly common issues that bind us together. None of them actually have anything to do with foreign policy or national security, but a range of issues from immigration, energy, woke, and some other things. And yes, there is a concerted effort in the U.S. to say, we want to encourage and empower and cheerlead for people who think the things that build a strong civilization, that build strong communities, strong nations, that we think are important. We want to applaud people that agree with that. Recently we've seen the Undersecretary for Public Affairs in the United States shift to a more prominent role and kind of be the spokesperson for that in the U.S. as opposed to some guy with a MAGA t-shirt. But the other leg of U.S. engagement, which I think is actually much, much more important, is the pragmatic engagement with working with countries that want to work with us. And so you can say Trump's leaving Europe, he's not, he's leaving NATO, he's not. But instead, if you've looked in the last 18 months, there's been a tremendous amount of American energy into connecting, particularly in areas of energy, collective security, and digital, and a few others, and looking for partners on this. So, for example, if you've seen in the last 30, 60 days, I think the U.S. has made more investments in bringing more energy, reliable, affordable, abundant energy to Europe in the last 60 days than the European Union has in the last several years. So that may not sound like the way we do business, and it may not sound super multilateral, it may not sound cheerleading for NATO and the EU, but I actually think in the end what we're doing is exactly that thing. We're building energy security. We are adding to collective defense. We're actually, I think, building more political stability across the transatlantic community by having honest debates about what we think we should and should not do. So I actually think it means better days for NATO ahead.
Herr Botschafter.
All right. Almost everything has now been said except by everybody. I think I should rather not get into this values versus interest discussion, which is worth having, but I'd like to start with a more fundamental remark about trying to respond to your original question about the health of the alliance. I think it doesn't really matter what I think or what Jim or anyone else here thinks about NATO. I think what really matters is what Vladimir Putin thinks. If he believes that this alliance continues to exist, and if he believes that he continues to be deterred by the existence of this alliance, then we're in good shape. I would make a distinction between capabilities, the facts on the ground, and the perceptions. As far as the perceptions are concerned, I'm worried, because actually I believe that the United States of America has been sending the exact wrong signals to Vladimir Putin over the last period, declaring publicly that there is an intention of withdrawing certain numbers of soldiers from Europe, plays, of course, into the hands of a Russian president who is not the first Russian president. I mean, the leaders of the Soviet Union had one desire beginning in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, namely to convince the United States of leaving Europe and leaving Europe to them, for Soviet or Russian domination. So I think the signaling was not less than perfect, let me put it diplomatically. But I do think as long as the United States is present in Europe with troops on the ground, when I last looked, we were talking about something like 80,000+ troops all over Europe, 30,000 plus in Germany alone, with nuclear weapons deployed in various European countries. In other words, the facts speak a good language, and I think that is what will until proven wrong, will keep convincing the Russian side that this NATO alliance works, because the Americans are still there. Again, on the perception side, I'm less certain that we've done the right thing. Second brief point about our relationship between the United States and her European allies. You know, I've been around for a long time, and I have what our French friends call a déjà vu kind of moment. I was ambassador in the United States in the post 9/11 period, and Germany, among with other European countries, came around after intense debates in those days, supporting the United States in the attempt to get rid of the Taliban, etc., Osama bin Laden, etc., in Afghanistan. So we and other European countries decided to deploy troops to Afghanistan, which was not an easy maneuver. In my own country, Chancellor Schröder at the time survived a vote of confidence with a majority of exactly 2 votes to get the troops to Afghanistan. So it was not so easy to get this done. At exactly that moment, or some months later, the United States didn't tell their allies first, but the allies, including me as a small ambassador in Washington, it began to dawn on me that the United States was now beginning to think about a different objective, namely called Iraq. And before we had finished the mission in Afghanistan, the United States decided to go after Saddam Hussein, and the rest is history, it's well known. In other words, we had a huge problem 20 years ago with agreeing priorities. Our priority was, let's go into Afghanistan. And then the United States came around, which is why I have this déjà vu sense now. I thought we had agreed that the single most worrisome threat to European and transatlantic security was the single-handed attempt by the Russian Federation to change borders in Europe, to invade Ukraine, to take Crimea, and then to occupy major parts of Donbass and keep bombing Ukrainian towns. We thought we had an agreement that that was supposed to be and continues to be our number one priority, at which point President Trump decides that he has now found a new priority called Iran. And in my humble opinion, we all hope that the Iran expedition, if that's what you want to call it, will lead to the desired result over time, namely helping us to get rid of the Iranian nuclear capabilities, etc., etc., etc. But what is happening at this moment is that our collective resolve to send the right messages to Moscow, end this war because you're not going to win it, I'm not so sure that that message continues to arrive in Moscow, with the message being from the United States that there are now no longer enough, that the supply of additional weapons, ammunition, etc., is no longer there because weapons need to be restored in this other theater of war in the Middle East, etc., etc. In other words, my worry is that our effort to get Russia to end this war is being weakened as we speak, and I would hope that we could reestablish this as a continuing collective priority for the entire alliance. Full stop.
Okay, good. Question number 2. NATO member state leaders say they have gotten the memo on burden sharing, burden shifting, but they have reacted differently. For the vast majority, it is more spending and improved capabilities. For a few, it is questioning 5% or not treating Russia as the major problem that it is. For others, it's ideas like the European Defense Union, or strategic autonomy, or other versions of these concepts. The EU Defense Commissioner the other day proposed a treaty to this effect on a European Defense Union, and the issue is getting attention in the European Parliament. Mark Rutte, however, has said that Europe is dreaming if it thinks that it can defend itself without the United States. So what do you all think about the European Defense Union and ideas like this, concepts out there in the public domain? Starting with you, General Eberhard. Is this any kind of an answer to the challenges that the
No, I think it was
face?
Robert Kagan who told us that US power allowed Europeans to think that military power wasn't important, and now we realise that it is, but we disinvested in the machinery of warfare so much that we have a long way to go. And so I worry sometimes that we're debating from such a position of weakness that it taints our arguments. And I just step back a bit. Andy Marshall, you remember Andy Marshall was the director of net assessment in the Pentagon for a long time. I think Glenn Howard's here somewhere who worked with him, and he had this great thing, of telling people to remember that seemingly contradictory things can be true simultaneously. And I think in this case, Europe needs to deepen its relationship with the US while simultaneously decoupling. And that decoupling is building our military capabilities. And I think the biggest challenge at the moment is we have a huge bow wave of money, but we're not converting that into military capability as quickly as possible. And the EU Strategic Compass, which I thought was a good document, makes it very clear that European collective defence is NATO's responsibility, and I think that's the right approach.
So deepening and decoupling at the same time.
Yes.
Ambassador.
I think that the request, the desire for a greater assumption of responsibilities on the European side by the American administration is a right desire, is a right request. By the way, is not a request that you can attribute to President Trump, because it comes from previous years, from other administrations of other colors since Obama till now. This is this should and will, in my opinion, sound like an alarm for the European side. We have to take it seriously. We have to take the positive side of this desire, of this request. We can jump perhaps on some sometimes irritual form of the request, but the substance is right, and I do think that the Europeans might have the force, the strength, the capability to concentrate on this request and to do their homework and to reinforce the European defense as the American side rightly requests. This being said, I go further. I add one single remark, that there is, as you probably know, in Europe a debate: should we have a more or less autonomous kind of integrated European defense? Now, to be realistic, if we want to be realistic, we cannot oversee the fact that as things stand now, there is only one practical, viable solution, and that solution consists in the strengthening of the European pillar of the Atlantic Alliance, within the Atlantic Alliance. Why do I say this? Because the Atlantic Alliance already foresees lots of operational coordination criteria, coordination systems, lots of common experience on which to build up even more the European side, the European pillar of the NATO defense. To imagine, theoretically, that we, in a short period of time, could elaborate a strictly European defense is an illusion. Come on, I'm not a military, but I speak under your control. It is an illusion. If we have to be quick and efficient, as we have to, then the main road is the strengthening of the European pillar of the NATO. This might, in my hopeful optimism, might encourage also a better understanding on the two sides of the Atlantic. So that is the way in which, for instance, a country like mine, like Italy, is trying to go ahead.
Man, I dodged a bullet there. Because I was going to have to say I agree with the German and not the Italian, and I'm Italian-American, so this would be terribly painful for me. But I also lived in Germany, so I love Germany. So, but now I agree with you, so I feel better. But I want to go back to a really important point that you made, and we could debate how Europeans view Trump's messaging on NATO. But you said something I thought even much is really more important, which is how do the Russians see this? And do the Russians really take all this rhetoric and rhetoric as the sign that NATO is really coming apart? Or do they look at the correlation of forces and say, what has gone well for me lately? And the answer is nothing, right? With NATO rearming, 1,000 miles of more frontier in the north, Ukraine that you can't walk around and attack NATO with. I think all the signs that the correlation of forces is going against the Russians are eminently there. And I'm sorry, but I'm just a simple military guy. If you can't win the war you're fighting, the idea that, oh, I'll just go start another war, that's never worked out well for anybody. So, but you all raise really good issues about what Europe has to do, and certainly that has to happen, but, and if we stop doing the kinds of things you've talked about in terms of building this European pillar, we will have a crisis of credibility down the road. But I would say right now, in terms of conventional deterrence, NATO's actually in pretty decent shape compared to where it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And when you look at the strategic pillar, because if there's one, we don't talk about this at all, but if there's one thing that is bipartisan in the United States, it is the commitment to rearm the American strategic pillar of deterrence. This is Democrats and Republicans. They don't agree on anything, not even what day of the week it is. But there is bipartisan commitment to the triad, bipartisan commitment to modernization, acceleration of the strategic bomber, serious American commitment, additional commitment in missile defense, much more cooperation with the U.S. in terms of strategic coordination and also helping people build up defense capabilities. So, and I really wonder if Putin looks at that a lot more than the rhetoric. And I actually believe Putin has the same problem as the Iranians, which is they don't really think Trump's going to blink. Putin doesn't really think that Trump's going to hand him Donbass. These are all fictions, and I think they know it's fictions, but they just don't know what else to do. I think that's their thing. And what I love about this from our perspective is, both for the Russians, and I know, you would say, let's focus on Ukraine, but I think what's true for the Russians and the Iranians both is, every day the wars go on for them, they're not better off than they were the day before. And that's going to continue down that path, and in the end, that's going to put the transatlantic community in a much stronger space than it was 4 or 5 years ago.
Herr Botschafter.
I have a very simple answer to your question. I think this is not an either-or kind of issue. I think we need to do both. There is this nice German word, Doppelstrategie. We used that the way back in, back in the day. Back 40 years ago, Doppelstrategie. We need to keep the alliance together. Hopefully we will be able to do that. We need to try to keep the United States engaged in Europe. Hopefully that will work. We need to keep NATO a credible deterrent from, and I think we agree on that, from the Russian point of view. But at the same time, of course, things are bound to change dramatically in a positive way. Let's just, if I may just use a minute of my time, let's just imagine that we Europeans collectively actually now being committed to 5%, or at least 3.5%, 5% total. If we actually do that over the next period of time, the amount of money spent by the European partners of the United States in NATO will not equal, but will come quite close to the U.S. defense budget. It is now, in the past it's been half or even less than half, right? It will be a huge increase. And if that huge increase is not going to lead to changes in the way we conduct our defense effort, then I have not understand anything. For example, currently, European countries spend approximately 60% of their procurement, expensive weaponry like F-35 fighter planes, etc. They buy that in the United States, right? There is no better alternative. We spend a huge amount of money. Let's assume 5 years from now we spend twice as much because we go from 2% to 3.5 or 4%. I think it is imperative, and I hope my American friends will understand that no European politician will survive his next election if he cannot demonstrate to his voters, like an American senator who will want to say, I made sure that there's going to be some additional work for people in Tennessee, in my home state. So elected politicians in Europe will say, I need to produce more work, in other words, more defense production in Europe. In other words, over time, as our defense effort increases, the percentage of production in Europe will need to change in favor of Europe, and I hope that my American friends will not fight that, because what it means in nominal terms, of course, the procurement in the United States will continue to rise over the foreseeable future. So I think this is a win-win situation if we handle it politically right. Final word, because I think Doppelstrategie is the right approach. I believe we need to build up, more than we've done in the past, an ability for Europe to be capable of taking military action if and when the United States either asks us to do that, or if the United States isn't willing to participate in this. We have done that occasionally in certain naval activities, right? You remember that. And I think there is no reason to get excited about the future of the transatlantic relationship if the European Union starts thinking about protecting itself, not only in civilian terms, but also in defense terms. I think you can do both, protect and continue to strengthen the alliance and make sure that the European countries can defend themselves, not only under the American umbrella, but if the need arises, also collectively in Europe and around our borders.
Yep. Both and in Doppelstrategie. General Eberhard, so the U.S.-Israeli operation against Iran has introduced more strain into the transatlantic relationship. Some NATO member states have supported it quietly, even if it's outside of area operation, but a few denied the United States free use of its military assets located on their territory. Some leaders have publicly criticized President Trump or distanced themselves from this operation. Now, this isn't new. I was at the U.S. Embassy in London in 1986 when a number of NATO allies denied access to the airspace for the Reagan strike against Libya, but Margaret Thatcher didn't block the F-111s. And then I remember Turkey in 2003. But these are different times. Do the Trump critics understand the damage that this does to the perception in Trump world of Europe and NATO allies, even if this is not an area operation, not a NATO operation, and regardless of what people think about the operation itself, and even if they admit to themselves that the world would be better off if this ends well? Have they gotten the message about the use of these assets, as Mark Rutte has said?
I think it comes back to my first point that we are divided sometimes by a common understanding of NATO process and language. NATO, capitals retain decision-making authority. The alliance works on the basis of consensus. There's a very clearly defined NATO area of responsibility. And then to act and almost demand that allies support you without previous discussions in an area outside the NATO area of responsibility isn't the way to gain friends or support. I personally think that the long-term objectives, of the Americans are good. I mean, no one wants Iran to have a nuclear weapon, but I think it could have been handled in a better way. And that's just a matter of, I think, understanding. But you're right, it's frustrating because it gives the image of an alliance divided, where again, I don't think we are. But if you make life difficult domestically for politicians, they'll have to turn towards their domestic audience.
Yeah. So, Ambassador VALENSISE, another question to you specifically. So the relationship that's very strong between President Trump and your Prime Minister has had a very positive impact on the transatlantic relationship, or how the White House looks at the transatlantic relationship. We know all the friction surrounding the Iran operation, but because of the Pope and Sigonella, et cetera. But did Secretary Rubio's visit last week, how did it go? What insights can you share with us? Were these kerfuffles with Sigonella and the Pope, et cetera, just blips, kerfuffles that are now in the rearview mirror, or is there any more to this? Those kerfuffles.
Yes, thank you. Before answering your nice question, may I go back very shortly to 2 points that Ambassador Ischinger raised that, in my opinion, are very relevant and very interesting. The first point concerns the credibility and the capability of real deterrence by the alliance. And this alliance has been based for 80 years on the principle of credible deterrence. That is why the argument you raised, Wolfgang, the argument of perception, is as important as the substance of our commitments. And I think that this is an element that from all sides of the alliance should be borne in mind very carefully, because much of the functioning of the system of the alliance is based on a credible perception. If any of us threatens this credibility, threatens this capability of real deterrence, well, then we do not serve the purposes of the alliance rightly. The second element, which I liked very much in your remarks, is the asymmetry between the American side and the European side in terms of industrial procurement. And I think that this phase, this period we are living, might and should boost energically the capability of the European side to avoid overlap, to avoid industrial overlaps, to have a stronger coordination. It is amazing that we have, 100 weapon system in comparison with the 3 or 4 weapon system that rightly the American side has. So there is a need, very acute, of quick and much quicker and much more efficient coordination, which we have to deal with. Let me come to the sexiest part of your question, the relations between President Trump and Prime Minister Meloni. They evidently belong to the same political area in general terms. There was a very strong feeling at the beginning of the Trump mandate. Meloni was one of the few European leaders that was invited on a personal basis at the inauguration. Then there has been perhaps some difficulties of communication along the telephone lines or the public communication, and that led to some critical remarks by the American president. Our Prime Minister was relatively moderate in her reply, bearing in mind how deep the relationship with the United States has to be for a country like ours, but not hiding the different approach to a couple of remarks that President Trump made, especially when it came to the criticism of what the Pope had said. This is obvious, this is more than natural. We share the same city with the Pope, so we needed to be obviously in solidarity with the Pope. Also considering the fact that the two remarks, Trump and Pope, were of course on a different level. Trump speaks as the leader of the major power in the world, as the political leader of the major power in the world. Pope Leon speaks in another capacity, in the capacity of the head of a great common and integrating institution, which is the Catholic Church. So I think after all the relation is not at all prejudged by this exchange of notes. The Italian side generally appreciated the visit of Mr. Rubio that took place a few days ago to the Pope, but also to the Prime Minister, and will build up in a cooperative way, trying to avoid any useless polemical criticism on both sides.
Jim,
I'm with the Pope, man.
No, this is not on the Pope. This is on back to NATO. Some allies are publicly questioning whether the United States would respond to an Article 5 event, like a Russian operation or invasion or whatever, against a NATO member state. And I personally think this speculation is unhelpful. But you deal with a lot of members of Congress and senior administration officials. Will the United States fulfill its obligations as an ally, or will it leave Europeans to handle the situation on their own?
Well, look, I mean, NATO is about the defense of the transatlantic community, and I think that is a consistent vital interest for the members of NATO, including the United States. You know, I often say, people will say, well, America's going to leave Europe, and I go, okay, so America leaves Europe, and Russia and China try to run wild in Europe. Where's the scenario where that's good for the United States? And you would say, well, there's none. Well, I go, well, that's why we're never leaving Europe. And, back to your point about basing, I actually think what this showed was the intense value of Europe as a strategic partner for the United States. We would not have been able to do Epic Fury without the proliferation of basing and logistical support we had in Europe. It would have been a bridge too far. And what the NATO alliance does, as you point, the NATO is there for collective defense. Underneath that is a series of national partners that can make any kind of basing deals they want. But what NATO provides is this community of all kinds of options for the United States. And as we've seen in virtually every conflict where we've had to base operations out of Europe, when somebody says no, several other people say yes. And so when we talk a lot about, Spain and some other countries, we don't talk near as much about Romania and Greece and Croatia and a number of other countries that saved American lives because of the amount of support that we were able to base out of there. So I actually think that the lesson from this is the value of NATO to the U.S. And so I actually think we're going to come out of it in a more positive manner.
I agree. Herr Botschafter, so President Trump's approach to NATO has been a shock to the system. You recently called it Der GAU, which is one of those great German phrases that translates into catastrophe, I guess.
So why does everything sound better in German? This is so
because they've got a word for everything. They've got an amazing word. Größter anzunehmender Unfall. You can't work this up. So you've questioned whether the United States is a dependable ally, and there was, of course, a lot of discussion of trust, of the trust issue. However, just as a thought experiment, do you think that Trump has any basis to ask the same question of allies, to question the dependability of NATO member states? Now, of course, every American remembers the support, the amazing support that NATO provided in Afghanistan after 9/11, but we're now, 25 years later. Is this question of dependability and trust also not a two-way street as opposed to a one-way street? Because thus far we've been hearing mostly about the one-way street, which, I understand the arguments, but what about the other side of the coin?
Yeah, I wouldn't dispute that. Of course, you can look at this both ways. But let me put it this way. The essence of this alliance, which has a lead nation called the United States of America, and the rest of us, more than 30, are much smaller, certainly in military terms, but also much smaller actors. There is a lead nation, and if this lead nation creates the impression, intentionally or unintentionally, that it's questioning the existence of this alliance, that of course creates huge waves. It is, almost totally irrelevant, excuse me for putting it this way, if one of the minor European NATO members questions the validity of NATO, well, so what? Next question. But if President Trump says, I'm not sure whether I like this NATO, or I can't quote verbatim, but he has in his first term and recently, of course, remember Greenland, many European countries, including our neighbor Denmark, was of course totally shocked by the idea that there would be between two NATO members, the lead nation NATO, the United States, and small Denmark, there could be a conflict of this nature. So, in other words, the reliability, the credibility, the protective role of the United States was questioned, whether we like it or not. And I have no problem with the idea, and of course we can, I'm sure Europeans have been negligent occasionally in making noises which have led, at least for some in the United States, to the assumption that these NATO partners are themselves not really reliable. So in other words, let me repeat what I said in the beginning. The facts on the ground is what really matters. And the United States is still there. Thank you very much. That's very good. At the perception level, at the level of what has been said by some, we can do better. I would be the first to criticize my own chancellor, who said publicly in front of a group of school children that he's not so sure that the United States has a good strategy on Iran. Well, I don't think the German chancellor should say that publicly, even if that's what he thinks, and even if it may be true. But you don't, as the chancellor of Germany, you don't need to say everything that you think. That's diplomacy. That's part of smart diplomacy. So, in other words, we've all misspoken occasionally, but the central issue, and I think this is where we agree, is to keep sending the message to Moscow that this alliance is not going to go away, and we're not going to allow some revisionist Russian ideology to go on occupying parts of Donbass or the entire Donbass, and then maybe Moldova, and then denying Georgia to Georgia or to other countries in Eastern Europe to become future members of the European Union, for example. How dare Russia to give these kinds of instructions to their neighbors. It's just not okay in the 21st century, and that is why I think it's so important that we, United States and Europeans, respond to these types of Russian attempts with clarity and determination.
General Eberhard, you wanted to say something?
Well, I just wanted, I haven't got a sense of sort of torsionless panic. I think, Trump's unpredictability, of course, is a great strength, but it makes European leaders nervous. I understand that. But you have to remember that NATO did not have a strategy. And in Trump 1, we delivered a very good forced employment strategy underpinned with a good family of plans. Then we found we couldn't pay for it. Trump 2 has delivered the leverage to generate the money to pay for the plans that we've agreed to deliver. And so actually, in 50 years' time, when people are writing a history on the alliance, they're going to thank Trump for what he's achieved. But I agree with everything you said. It's just his unpredictability makes us nervous, but no sense of tortious panic, I think.
Okay. We're only a couple minutes left. I have a lightning round where I'll ask one question of everybody in no more than 2 sentences, please. Okay, what is the one thing that keeps you up these days with regard to the U.S.-European relationship? No more than 2 sentences, please. General.
I'll go first, nothing.
Okay, Jim.
Okay.
Those are 2 sentences?
We couldn't hear that really.
What keeps you awake?
What keeps you awake as far as the transatlantic relationship right now in the security defense?
As far as the transatlantic relationship.
Yeah.
There is
2 sentences.
One word.
One word.
2 sentences, 1 word.
One word.
Okay.
Methodology is also important as far as perception is concerned, as far as the clearness of the message is concerned, and to methodology belongs also the habit, the use, the value of consultation among allies.
Okay, good.
Let's not forget
Okay,
it.
that's 4 sentences, right? That's
Unpredictability.
unpredictability. Herr Botschafter.
Very simple. My worry is, can we figure out a way to make this next NATO summit, just a few weeks away in Turkey this time, can we figure out a way to make that as much a success as we managed together, the Trump administration and Europeans, to make the Hague summit last year a success?
Okay.
Turkey will be very, very important. I hope it's going to be a successful summit.
Okay, one last question, lightning round. A number of recent polls have recently suggested that the United States or President Trump is the biggest threat to Europe or to world peace, or at least more of a threat than communist China or Russia. Do you agree? And if so, why? If not, why not? No more than 2 sentences, please.
No, I don't agree.
Okay. Ambassador.
Nor do I.
Look, Trump is not a young man in a hurry. He has a limited time left, and he has a lot of things he really wants to get done, and that makes him even more brusque and irascible than usual. Maybe you like it, maybe you don't like it, but it's not unpredictability. It's a drive of purpose that I think in the end will be better for Europe and the United States.
I think this is ridiculous to compare Trump with the kinds of threats that China or Russia represent. No, let's be relaxed about it.
Yeah, I know. Unfortunately, these polls keep getting published, and then they get headlines, etc. So we're over our time. Thank you, gentlemen, for a great conversation. Thank you all for joining us.